from the world of politics.
Look at what's happening to inflation. It is hurting families all across this country. This has got to stop.
To the world of business.
Capitalism needs multiple drivers of success.
This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. We start today in Washington, where they are making news already. We're going to hear from the president later today about COVID-19, but already the White House has issued an executive order. We turn now to Joe Matthew. He is, of course, our Washington correspondent and host of Sound On, airing every day on Bloomberg Radio. So, Joe, thanks for being there. Tell us about this mandate saying federal workers have to get vaccinated.
Yes, indeed, a mandate, David, that we'll hear more details about a little later on today, 5 o'clock Wall Street time. President Biden will address the nation on COVID. Just imagine where we were back on the 4th of July when the president stood at the White House and said we were close to declaring independence from COVID. Then, of course, the Delta variant happened, and a lot has changed since then. 176,000 new cases were recorded yesterday in the United States. That's compared to about 10,000 on a daily average when we hit the low in June. And so the president finds himself trying to catch up to this story again today. It is being mandated that all executive branch federal workers, David, and contractors who work with them will have to get a vaccine. The difference between now and the last time the president talked about this is there will be no opt-out. Before now, they had a chance to mask and be tested regularly and forego the vaccine. Now, if you want to work for the federal government, David, and this is millions of people we're talking about, you must get the shot. The president will talk about that in detail later.
So, as you said, it's going to affect millions of people, federal workers. But I also wonder, Joe, do we have a sense of whether this is also trying to set an example for others? Because we've talked to any number of large employers who said, yes, we're going to require vaccines, but we'll have this testing as an alternative. Maybe this is saying, you know what, you private employers maybe should follow our lead.
That's right. The president will, in fact, encourage private businesses to follow the example of this White House. It has been kind of a going thought here in the executive branch that a patchwork of private companies with vaccine mandates combined with orders like this one from the federal government will help make the difference. David, everyone was supposed to go back to work this month after Labor Day as kids went back to school. And as you well know and have been reporting here on Balance of Power, we've got 10 million jobs that are unfilled now. People are not coming back at the rate to which the economists were predicting, and our recovery is very much on the line here. With the news today from Microsoft, for instance, the president is trying to stop this trend before it gets worse.
No question. At the same time, there's a lot of other things going on in Washington. Congress may not be fully back in session, but they are working, as I understand it. They're marking up that so-called reconciliation bill. Where are they on that?
Yes. The hard work now begins. We've been talking about this a lot, been debating about it a lot, but indeed, the Ways and Means Committee is in session right now marking up this bill. This is how it will be determined what goes into the reconciliation bill. How large will it be? And how will they pay for it? Some of the tax increases that have been proposed are going to now be hashed out. That's the job of Ways and Means. It's also responsible, though, David, for Medicare. And one of the biggest parts of this plan is an expansion of Medicare to include hearing, vision, and dental. That may or may not end up in the final package, but that's where we start. And I would just point you again to the timeline. The House is only going to be in session 8 days for real this month. And we're coming up on some big deadlines at the end of the month, not just fulfilling the reconciliation order here, but also the debt limit and a government bill, a funding bill to keep the government running into next month. And so there's a lot on the line.
And Joe, as you know so terribly well, when you're talking reconciliation, you're talking about unanimity among the Democrats. There are reports coming out of the Hill that there may be some division, actually not between conservatives and more liberals, but actually between the House and the Senate over that question of Medicare versus Medicaid, where we have the Senate really pushing hard on expanding Medicare on things like hearing and vision support, whereas the House might be more concerned about Medicaid for some of the poor.
It has been said more than once, David, that Democrats remain Democrats' biggest problem. And to your point, Democrats will only be the ones voting for reconciliation. I spoke with the ranking member on the House Ways and Means Committee this week, Kevin Brady, as you did. He made clear that not a single Republican will vote for a tax hike. So Republicans are out of this picture and Democrats are on their own.
So what's going on up at Capitol Hill in terms of lobbying? I mean, this is when the lobbyists really come to the fore, right? Because there are a lot of people who don't particularly want their taxes increased, both individuals and corporations. Yes. Boy, you can retain a lot of lobbyists on those issues.
Somebody's making a lot of money on this as usual, David, and we have been reporting on Bloomberg a multi-million-dollar advertising and lobbying blitz is not about to get started. It's already underway. Groups from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce right across the street from where I'm standing, all the way to the National Association of Manufacturers, are dumping an enormous amount of money into this effort to prevent taxes from going up.
Okay, Joe, always great to talk with you. That's Joe Matthew. He's our Washington correspondent. But as important, more important, he's the host of Sound On. That airs every single day on Bloomberg Radio, and including this week, starting this week, at 106.1 FM in Boston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Congress, as you mentioned, is ramping up its work on President Biden's economic agenda. At the center of the action today will be the tax-writing House Ways and Means Committee. Members will update measures on expanding Medicare, paid family leave, and funds for elder care workers. Some committee votes are scheduled on core pieces of the planned $3.5 trillion tax and social spending budget bill. As we mentioned earlier here on Bloomberg, all federal employees in the United States will have to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Bloomberg has learned President Biden will sign an executive order today requiring the vaccination for all executive branch employees and federal contractors. The move comes as the Delta variant surges and threatens to overwhelm hospitals in parts of the U.S. Mr. Biden will speak from the White House today at 5 p.m. Wall Street time. In Berlin, German prosecutors raided the finance and justice ministries today as part of an investigation into whether officials at the anti-money laundering unit failed to handle cases correctly. The case centers on the warnings that banks sent the financial intelligence unit about a payment of €1 million to Africa. North Korea has staged its first military-style parade since Joe Biden became U.S. president. Kim Jong-un presided over an event where displays of weapons are scaled down from previous exhibitions. There were no ballistic missiles rolled through the streets. The parade marked the anniversary of North Korea's founding, and it took place as the government battles a major food crisis. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Coming up, the ECB is slowing down the pace of its pandemic bond buying program. More on the path to recovery for the euro area. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. In a highly anticipated decision, the European Central Bank announced today that it would set a moderately lower pace for its bond purchases program, a sign that the Governing Council is optimistic about the pace of Eurozone recovery. Yet, President Lagarde acknowledged that the recovery was not without its headwinds.
Production continues to be held back by shortages of materials and equipment. The spread of the Delta variant has so far not required lockdown measures to be reimposed, but it could slow the recovery in global trade and the full reopening of the economy.
Joining us now from London is Stephanie Flanders. She's Bloomberg's Senior Executive Editor for Economics. Stephanie, thank you so much for being back with us. Since she said what she said, there's been this raging debate about whether this was a taper or was not a taper. I wondered, was it a taper or not, and why do we care?
Well, of course, we've had, we're getting a kind of compare and contrast of central banks around the world, certainly the big developed country ones, as they all are at slightly different stages of this process. And the wording matters, and I get the sense that the European Central Bank in particular was very concerned about the language that was used today. And Christine Lagarde herself said she's not for tapering, this is a recalibration. I guess they can somewhat get away with it in the European Central Bank because they do have this added flexibility, this additional program, the PEP, which is not available to the Federal Reserve. So they can talk about going back to the original pace that they had in the first part of the year, which is what they seem to have done, the ECB, today. They're going to go back to probably around 70 billion a month, which was where they were in the first few months of this year. They can talk about that without necessarily putting themselves on a glide path to interest rate increases, which is perhaps a little bit harder for the Fed. It's a bit more kind of black and white.
You're going to have to help me sort this out, because I understand there are a couple of different programs. There's a PEP program, which is particularly related to the pandemic, and that is actually due to expire, I believe, in March. Isn't that correct? And they have a certain amount of money. Does it appear that they're going to use all that money?
Yeah, I think that's still going to be the goal, to use all the money. But the big battle, you're right, David, is going to be about the shift from one program to the other. So there's the PEP, which was the special COVID-related one. Also, incidentally, importantly for countries like Greece, has a lot more flexibility in it in terms of which bonds you can buy for the European Central Bank. You don't have to worry about whether you're reaching a limit on the rules of how much you can buy for each country, which is very helpful if you're Greece or Italy and you may need more support than the likes of Germany. Once we lose the PEP, they will be on to the old-fashioned, plain old vanilla asset purchase scheme, which the APP, which they may have to ramp up as they go into next year in order to compensate, in order to not look like they're necessarily tapering. So it is a bit complicated. You end up with all these ECB acronyms, but the real point is, how much are they going to focus on that long-term inflation target and really getting inflation back to 2%? And how much are they going to be really just looking at the short-term recovery and pushing to normalise policy?
Well, we'll talk about that inflation issue, if you would, because they're sort of changing their approach, as I understand it. There were some that thought that they needed to taper, whatever you call it, because you saw really a step up in inflation. But the projections they came out with this today actually projected like they're still going to be under their target 2 years out.
Yeah, I mean, we would really be talking about it if they ever forecast they were actually going to meet their target in a 2 or even 3 year time frame. You're absolutely right. There were two things that were going on today. There's the short-term cyclical recovery, which is actually looking a bit stronger than it did the last time they were doing those forecasts. But there is this long-term issue that they still are not forecasting that they're going to meet the 2% target, which they reaffirmed in that strategy, the review that they came out with in the summer. And that could have been something that they could have signalled at this meeting. They could have said, you know what, you might expect us to be now thinking about rate rises in maybe 2 years, 3 years. We're going to push it even further down the road because we have this newly emphatic commitment to that 2% target. They didn't do that. And as you say, those forecasts for 23 in particular and 24 are not much higher on the inflation front than they were before.
So, Stephanie, take us through just a little bit about the relationship between coming off of quantitative easing, whether it's PEP or AP or whatever you call it, on the one hand, and raising rates on the other. As you know, Jay Powell, the chair of the Fed back here, has been very careful to say we're going to come down off of the bond buying, and there'll be some gap perhaps between that and any time we consider rate rises. Is that the plan in the ECB? Do we know?
Well, again, that's an interesting one. At the moment, that is very much not the plan, in the sense that they are committed to having, when they move on to just the plain old asset purchases on the APP, they're committed, once those purchases end, to having a rate rise quite soon after that. Now, there's quite a few people on the Governing Council who say that's going to box them in, and that every time they talk about the rate of purchases, they're going to be automatically saying something about the first rate rise. Now, as you say, Jay Powell has very explicitly got himself out of that and separated the two, taken away the linkage. I think the European Central Bank will be quite keen to do the same, but hawks will want to keep that linkage because they'll want to feel like they are actually heading to a rate rise.
So you put your finger on it, Stephanie, of course, hawks and doves. How unanimous is the ECB at this point? I guess the decision today was unanimous, but do we know what's going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, I have a feeling that Christine Lagarde, she wouldn't like me saying this, but I think she was sort of tapping into her previous life as a finance minister, where you put off difficult decisions for as long as possible. So she could have had a bit more of a debate around the table at this meeting between those hawks and the doves, the ones who say, look, we've got a strong recovery, we've even got some inflation, we should get off these extraordinary measures, it's causing distortions in financial markets, etc., etc. And the doves, who are also still quite strong in their opinions. She just punted that to the next set of forecasts in December. But yeah, those two sides, as we've seen in the ECB for years, North versus South countries, will be drawing their battle lines.
So, Stephanie, we've been talking, of course, about monetary policy, which is the ECB's purview. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, what happened to fiscal stimulus? I mean, some months ago, you and I talked about all this money that's coming in green investing, and we had Ms. van der Leyen, who's really got to come to the rescue. Is that money coming, and when?
It is on the way, and actually you've got a lot more concrete idea now of what countries are going to spend it on. A lot of all eyes, for example, on Italy, on how they're going to spend their money. But you raise an interesting question, because there are two pieces of unfinished business that come out of today's meeting, one of which the ECB can control a bit more than the other. There's, where is the quantitative easing? Where is monetary policy going after the end of this year? How much might it continue to support countries like Greece and Italy with those bond purchases? But the other side is the debate that those same countries, Greece and Italy and others, want to have about the Fiscal Stability and Growth Pact. On paper, in fact, on a treaty, they're committed to keeping their budget deficits within these very low grounds, and also keeping a lid on their debt and bringing their debt stocks down. There's plenty of people who say post-crisis those rules need to change and allow for more fiscal stimulus going forward. And that's a debate that's barely started. Of course, it can't really start until after the German election.
Okay, Stephanie, it's always such a pleasure to have you with us, and so helpful, I must say. Stephanie Flanders of Bloomberg Economics. For more on the crowded agenda in Congress, to go back to Washington now, we're going to welcome Representative Nikema Williams. She's a Democrat from Georgia. So, Madam Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us. We have a lot to talk about, but let's start actually with the discussion on Capitol Hill about the Build Back Better as well as the infrastructure plan. Where does that stand right now?
It's good to be with you today to talk about all of the things happening in Washington. We're going through a committee markup process this week, and I'm on the House Financial Services Committee, and we're starting to have our hearings to make sure that we are not only focused on traditional infrastructure, but the human infrastructure needs to get our economy back on track and to truly build back better. So that's where we are right now. We still have some work to do on the House side to meet the moment of what this moment calls for to get our economy back on track. So we're still doing the work in Washington.
So pocketbook issues are always first and foremost, but I must say there are other things going on, particularly at the state level right now, that have a lot of attention, I'm sure, of people in Washington as well. First of all, Texas with their so-called abortion law. Some talk about maybe that might get done in your home state of Georgia as well. Where does that stand? I guess it's called the heartbeat law?
So Georgia passed, when I was in the state Senate, the Georgia General Assembly passed and the governor signed into law essentially an all-out abortion ban that kind of mimics the Texas law that bans abortions at 6 weeks before most women even know that they're pregnant. And so this law that was signed in has been enjoined since it was signed into law and is not currently in effect, but it's due to be heard in federal court on September 24th. So we will see what happens here. And one thing that I've been trying to remind people is that the Texas law was not allowed to move forward on the merits of the constitutionality, but based on procedural issues with the way that the case was brought to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has not said that law is constitutional, which I continue to assert that it is not. And I think we'll see that when we hear the Georgia law heard in court later this month.
Congressman, we have the abortion issue that's really causing a lot of consternation around the country, affecting a lot of women in particular. We also have the voting rights issues. And I wonder, apart from the people directly affected, which clearly is the first and foremost concern, what are the possible economic effects of this? Do you see, for example, in Georgia, any potential reluctance of companies to move to the state or to stay in the state? We hear some reports that might be true in Texas.
So we kind of saw some of that when the abortion ban was first passed in Georgia, and we have a booming industry in film and entertainment. And so we saw some people hesitant to come and film in the state based on women not being able to get the care that they need if they should need it. And so I don't know what exactly will happen with the business industry, but I do know that we're going to continue to fight this on every front, because women deserve to have the ability to make personal medical decisions with consultations with their doctors.
Congressman, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you with us. That's Congresswoman Nikema Williams. She's a Democrat of Georgia. More on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Chinese regulators have told gaming companies there that they need to de-emphasize profits and that more regulation is on the way. They are our stocks of the hour, and Dave Wilson is here with the story. So de-emphasize profits, that's an interesting concept.
Yeah, it certainly is. But, we're talking about China and state-run capitalism, so there are a number of interesting concepts involved here. I mean, we're talking about the likes of Tencent Holding that gets about 30% of its revenue from gaming, NetEase, Bilibili, all down in U.S. trading, and they were summoned along with their peers into a meeting with representatives of 4 regulatory agencies. Now, bear in mind, the other day, you had the restrictions put in terms of young people only being able to play games an hour a day, Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays. And, among other things, the regulators talked about how they're going to really step up enforcement, and they're going to be checking to see whether these companies comply with the law. So, that's what they're facing at this point. But I'll tell you, this is part of a much bigger puzzle. We've seen it play out across a number of tech-related industries. And, you take a look at these companies in Hong Kong. The Hang Seng Tech Index is a good way to track them. I mean, they've just, taken a tumble this year. The index down about 22% for the year. Lots of red on the screen. The group was just trying to come back in the past few weeks. You had BlackRock set up its first China fund, for example, and now they're down again. As the latest bit of regulatory crackdown comes in, and so we're talking about companies that have lost billions upon billions of market value over time.
I wonder, though, Dave, is it all consumer-facing? Because at the same time, President Xi very much wants a very strong tech sector in terms of defense and cyber and things like that. Can he have it both ways?
Well, that becomes the real question. You look across the industries that have been affected by this. You think about online retailing. You think about ride-hailing with Didi Global, or food delivery with Meituan. You can make the argument that there is more of a consumer focus on it. That said, it's not all right in front of people in the sense that they're concerned about data privacy, and you're talking about the back office in that sense. And certainly the government wants to have its hand in making sure that data doesn't give these companies too much power.
Are there some U.S. companies who could benefit from the disadvantage to some of the Chinese companies?
Well, I mean, this is the challenge because China is such a controlled market. Now, you do have U.S. video game companies that at least have deals with the likes of Tencent in China, but the problem is they can't just come in and compete. I mean, China licenses video games, and in fact, they didn't license any in August, and the South China Morning Post is reporting there's at the very least going to be a slowdown going forward.
That's a tough business. Thank you so much, Dave Wilson, for that report on Chinese gaming stocks. Coming up, California voter habits are changing just as Governor Newsom faces a recall vote in the state. USC professor Mindy Romero will be with us next. And this is Balance of Power. We are on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
News in Texas. Bloomberg has learned the Justice Department plans to sue Texas over its strict law that critics say is unconstitutional. The measure bans abortions after 6 weeks and deputizes citizens to sue people who perform or aid in the procedure. Last week, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to block the law. Abortion providers in Texas had asked the court to put a hold on the measure while it's being challenged in lower courts. The United Nations suffered a cyber attack earlier this year. The cybersecurity firm Resecurity says the hackers appear to have gotten in pretty easily. They went to the dark web and purchased a UN employee's stolen username and password. From there, the hackers were able to gain deeper access to the UN's network. The firm says the first known breach of the UN systems was on April 5th, and the hackers were still active as of August 7th. About 200 foreigners, including Americans, flew out of Afghanistan on an international commercial flight from Kabul airport today. It was the first such large-scale departure since U.S. and foreign forces concluded their frantic withdrawal at the end of last month. The Qatar Airways flight to Doha marked a significant breakthrough in the rocky coordination between the United States and Afghanistan's new Taliban rulers. The Taliban are accusing the U.S. of violating last year's peace deal signed in Doha, and they're calling on the Biden administration to immediately lift sanctions against senior members of the Taliban's new cabinet. That includes Afghanistan's new acting interior minister, who is on the FBI's most wanted list for terrorism. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Things may be looking up for California Governor Gavin Newsom. Polls and mail-in ballot returns are trending toward a positive outcome for the Democrat in the recall election due next week. And Vice President Kamala Harris showed her support yesterday in the state. Mindy Romero is a research assistant professor at the University of Southern California and founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy. Mindy joins us now. So, Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Give us a sense of where the polls are right now. I thought it was neck and neck, but now it looks like maybe Gavin Newsom's pulling ahead a little bit, at least in the polls.
Yeah, well, it was neck and neck for quite a while, to everyone's surprise. But in the last few polls, the last couple of weeks, we've seen a widening out, much more comfortable margin for Newsom. In many polls, a 12 percentage point margin, for instance. And the early ballots that are coming in, which are even greater test, I think, are showing overwhelmingly Democratic, as they should be in a deep blue state. But they're giving some, I think, some relief to Newsom and the anti-recall effort.
As far as you can tell, what's causing the shift? Is it simply people coming back from the summer and paying attention for the first time? Or are there issues that are really driving it?
I think you're right to some degree. Certainly, as the polls were being conducted earlier in the summer, there were far fewer people that were paying attention to the recall that even knew that the recall was happening, let alone what the stakes were all about. And that's what I think the last couple of weeks or last month for Newsom has been a really big push at trying to raise the stakes, literally talking about talking about the recall as being a matter of life and death, right? The choice between Newsom and potentially a Republican replacement candidate. So I think the stakes have been raised. More people are paying attention. People have got also their vote by mail ballot in the mail in California for this election. All registered voters were given a vote by mail ballot. And they're starting to get some of that messaging. It's becoming a reality around the race and having to make a decision. And I think certainly the emergence of Larry Elder on the Republican side has given Newsom a great kind of foe to position himself against. That is also, I think, helping.
There's some high-profile national political names that are weighing in now. We have President Biden cutting some commercials. We have Kamala Harris from California going to California. We have former President Obama. Does it make a difference for these big national figures to appear?
Well, and that's part of Newsom's strategy, right? It's to bring in the big anchors to talk about why it matters, to get people's attention, to tell people, hey, this isn't a slam dunk. Because a lot of polls were showing us that his supporters felt like, if they were paying attention, they didn't really feel like it mattered for them to vote because they thought, it was a done deal. He was going to run away with it. What were the consequences around it? And so I think bringing in certainly like Barack Obama, but to our state, Harris and Biden are getting people's attention and making them feel like there is some consequence to this. And certainly it brings just more news coverage, which reminds people there's an election and tells them what the date is and so forth, which is also important because, this is the only thing on our ballot out here. It's an off-cycle election. Just making sure people understand that there is actually an election happening and what they're supposed to do with that ballot, that it's not just a sample ballot, I think is also just part of this whole approach that Newsom has to really aggressively take.
Mindy, what do we know about the Latino vote? All of us paid attention to a New York Times piece that basically said the Latino vote is really not prepared to come out in a strong fashion for Gavin Newsom, that maybe he's overlooked them or hasn't given them enough attention and love. What do you know about the Latino vote?
Yeah, well, it's certainly complicated because I'll say this at the outset. Of course, Latinos are not a monolithic group, right? Even in California. But that being said, Latinos are in California overwhelmingly skewed Democratic in terms of their registration. That's important for us to understand. Overwhelmingly, Latinos feel like, if you look at some of the polls, that the state is going in the right direction. Some of the data have shown us that maybe that not as many Latinos, certainly than as whites, for instance, have supported Newsom and opposed the recall. And some of those numbers I think were surprising for many analysts. But, overall, the vote itself, any statewide race, any time, if you don't take the Latino vote seriously in California, it's going to be at your own peril. And I think Newsom, there's been some challenges for Newsom in terms of how well he's outreached to the Latino vote. It's harder in this type of election to get the word out to voters, period, because there is only one thing on the ballot and they're not expecting an election at this point in time. And it can be historically, this type of election, a special election, can be just harder to reach Latinos, period. And, Newsom has been trying in the last week, particularly or so, to develop additional outreach methods to the Latino vote. It's still an open question about how successful he's been. So I'll say bottom line, Latinos will be a big part of this electorate, of those voting. Already, they're about 17% of the ballots that have been cast thus far in the early vote. It will be a challenge for them to be as representative as represented as they were in the November 2020 general election. Latinos will be underrepresented compared to their numbers in the population, but they still will be a formidable force. And Newsom would do well as on the recall side, on the Republican replacement side, to pay more attention to the Latino vote, particularly because Latinos are a little more likely than other groups to wait to vote in person. And so there's still an opportunity to transition those voters, right, those potential voters into voters. It's not a done deal yet. We've got a lot of days of voting, and we have all the way up until Election Day for the Latino vote.
Pretty soon, we're going to be turning our attention to the midterm elections in 2022. And I wonder, from your point of view, do you think that there might be some lessons for the Democrats that might come out of California, either positive or negative? I mean, when you talk about Latinos, for example, I remember in 2020, there were some surprises in Florida because it was perceived Democrats had sort of taken it for granted. Should the Democrats nationally be looking at things in California to indicate something about 2022?
Yes, and they are. And that's why you see people like Warren and Harris and Biden and former President Barack Obama paying attention and campaigning for this governor. The recall has consequences. It's not just about September 14th. It's not about who wins or who doesn't win when it comes to the recall election. There are already consequences for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party here in our state in California and nationally. So if Newsom doesn't run away with this, right, there's a big question. It looks like he's going to win, but how, by what margin? And if it is at all close, that will be not meeting expectations. And I think in many camps, it's going to be looked at as a failure, and certainly spun as a failure by Republicans here in our state and nationally. That has implications, that fuels kind of the narrative nationally in terms of, the push against Democrats and their policies, and saying Democrats, have bad management and don't serve the needs of voters. So much so that a deep blue state like California is almost kicked out its Democratic governor. That narrative can fuel other recall efforts, can fuel fundraising, recruitment across the country for Republicans, but also very much going into the 2022 midterms. And of course, don't forget, here in California, we've got a number of competitive seats in any given midterm election that affect the balance of power.
Yeah. Professor, it's always great to talk to you about California politics. That's Mindy Romero. She is USC Research Assistant Professor. Coming up, the effect of rising prices on American farmers with CoBank CEO Tom Halverson. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The USDA 2021 September Farm Income Forecast is out, and at first blush, it looks like things are looking pretty good for America's farmers. To take us through what is really happening on the ground, we welcome now Tom Halverson. He's CEO of CoBank, which specializes in banking our agricultural sector. Great to have you back, Tom. Talk about farms. We want to talk about you. So, what's your read on what the USDA said? It looks like things are really pretty rosy.
Well, we felt pretty good before even this most recent USDA report, but if you read it carefully, it's a really robust story, right? Net farm income is projected by the Department of Agriculture to be up 20%. to a level of $113 billion, which is a level we haven't seen since 2013. So in aggregate, on average across the country, that's a really good story. But when you peel beneath that and start looking around, you'll find that there's quite a lot of differentiation across the country, across different parts of the agricultural production process, et cetera.
So take us into that just a little bit. I did notice that in the same report, the median income is projected to come down. And when the median's coming down, the overall is going up. That tends to suggest, to me at least, that the rich are getting richer, but it's not necessarily getting distributed. Is that what's going on with farmers?
That's partly the case. The same sort of forces of economic gravity that operate in other sectors of the economy operate in agriculture too. So there's rewards for economies of scale and so forth. Large producers are getting larger, faster, et cetera. But it's also the case that there's concentration kind of geographically and by product. So what do I mean by that? If you look at USDA's projections, what you'll see is the parts of the complex that are doing the best, enjoying the most upside at the moment this year, are oil seeds, row crops, so wheat, corn, soybeans, pork, et cetera, highly concentrated in the breadbasket Midwestern and upper Midwestern states. So they are having the most upside and enjoying the greatest volume and particularly the greatest price appreciation upside. So they are outperforming the most. If you take, for example, the Western United States, everything west of my house in Colorado, the combination of specialty products, so a portfolio of different types of products, which are having different price and supply and demand dynamics, exacerbated, of course, by terrible drought conditions, unevenly distributed across the entire Western United States. The story there is of a net decline of net farm income on a consolidated basis. So the average looks one way, but when you slice and dice it by geography and by product, it looks quite uneven.
Well, you raised an interesting question there. Of the people who are going up, who are doing better, how much of it's because they're selling more, and how much of it's because they can charge more for it? How much is volume and how much of it's price?
It's price in the first instance, volume in the second, right? If you look at where the main row crop commodities, corn and soybeans prices they're at very high levels not seen since 2013, 2014. So that's driving what is happening, because inside, again, if you peel below the top, you see what's going on is that the number is going up to 113 billion, up 20%, as I say. That underneath that is a lot of price appreciation times volume times output, but a substantial reduction, as we expected last time we spoke, a substantial reduction in transfer payments from the Department of Agriculture and the federal government. So there's a big upside from market forces, which is what everybody wants to see, and then there's some downside to a substantial reduction in transfer payments.
I'm so glad you went there, because I was going to ask you about that, because we know President Trump had a lot of transfer payments because of what was going on with the Chinese trade dispute, basically. It appears that they're weaning themselves off of that. Insofar as it's really going well, is it because of exports, and how much of it is China?
I think exports are a big portion of it. We're set again in the data. What we see is we're likely to have the best export year ever. We're going from 25 to sort of 30% of all of our production across products and so forth to be exported. So never in our history has exports been more important to the rural American economy, which is substantially dependent on the agricultural production economy. In China, while it hasn't met the numerical quantitative goals of the agreement that was signed now about 18 months ago, has done very well and has bought a lot, because they needed, they're not doing us a favor and buying things they don't need. They need it and they're buying it. That volume has been near record levels as well. We can be very grateful for that. And because we have the most efficient and productive agricultural sector in the world, the need for export markets to be fair and level for the access of our exports has never been more important than it is today.
So, Thomas, you bank these entities of various sorts. Are they really improving the balance sheets a lot? Do they look a lot stronger today than they did 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
If you look at hundreds or thousands of customers, they're not all doing the same thing. Right. Some are weaker for whatever reasons. But in aggregate, absolutely. If you look at institutional customers that we bank, or individual producers that are affiliated Farm Credit Association partners across the country bank, in aggregate, balance sheets are looking better because cash flows are looking better. Leverage levels are getting lower.
Can you keep going, and for how long?
Well, there's some interesting things going on in terms of price pressure and the like, right? So margins aren't going to look as great 6 months from now because there's a lot of price pressure. Fuel's up a lot. Feed, if feed is an input cost in your process, is up a lot. Labor is rising and so forth. So some of that upside is being arbed away, as is normally the case, through input inflation. But I think we can have confidence that supply and demand forces are going to lead to a really good year this year, and that there's momentum into next year, too.
Tom, so great to have you with us always. We're going to have more with CoBank CEO Thomas Halverson coming up in our second hour on Bloomberg Radio. Coming up, we take a look ahead at President Biden's address on COVID. That'll be coming up at 5 p.m. Eastern Time today. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. President Biden will speak later today at the White House on the issue of how to deal with COVID. We have reports already coming out that there will be an order on vaccination requirements for federal workers. To set the stage for all of this, we welcome now Bloomberg White House reporter Josh Wingrove. Josh, thanks so much for being with us. First, start with the reports of this executive order. What do we think it's going to say?
Yeah, essentially it's going to be expanding, David, the number of federal employees affected by the vaccine order and taking away the option B that they had. So it used to be that you had to be vaccinated, or you could opt for a testing and sort of masking regime, sort of a second option. It appears that Biden is going to take that away. In other words, force all federal employees to do this. He's also going to expand the number of federal contractors potentially that will be affected by this. I should caution that we don't have full details yet. We expect, of course, to learn those later today, and that could include some exemptions potentially for religious grounds or for disability or that sort of thing. But broadly speaking, Biden is going to take the stage this evening to give a speech, an update on the COVID response. And I think that key pillar is expanding the requirements of federal workers to get vaccinated. They see these sort of employer mandates as a real key way to drive vaccinations among folks who have not gotten the shot yet.
Yeah, it may cause other employers to follow suit, but the federal government itself don't they employ literally millions of people?
Yes, this will affect millions of people, no doubt. And I think, broadly speaking, they do absolutely want to sort of get ahead of the band. They want people to follow them and employers to follow suit and do this. Remember, what triggered a lot of this was that approval by the FDA of Pfizer's vaccine, that higher level than the emergency authorization that we've been using until then. So, they sort of have been sort of leading the charge since then, encouraging people to go here. Now, how it's going to work or if it's going to work, unclear. We've seen an uptick in vaccinations. It's been trickling back down again, unfortunately. But on the flip side, the U.S. this week crossed a threshold of 75% of adults with at least one shot. Remember, 70% had been the previous target that was missed just a couple of months ago, so they're now at 75. So things are moving, but they're trailing off. They hope that these moves will sort of reinvigorate the vaccine pace.
So the White House has been very consistent. President Biden's been very consistent saying we need vaccines. We need vaccines. At the same time, I've seen some reports that what he talks about at 5 o'clock this evening may go beyond vaccines, go into things like testing, expanding testing, and also maybe genomic tracing.
Yes, absolutely. We expect 6 sort of pillars to this. Testing is one of it. What to watch for there is whether they throw any more money at it. Remember, we've had trouble getting tests in the U.S. here because the capacity seemed to dwindle as cases dwindled, and then when cases spiked, no one could find a test anymore. So we expect that. We probably will hear him talk about boosters. David, remember, they're planning a week from Monday to start booster shots with Pfizer only, probably at this point, for people who've been 8 months since their second shot. That was some of the first people to get a shot, healthcare workers, the elderly, that kind of thing. So that, testing, also schools. We don't know whether he's going to announce anything on schools, but there's been pressure on the CDC to update its rules for schools. We'll see if Joe Biden does some of that. But essentially, he's going to sweep together some of the stuff that they've maybe announced in the last weeks and months when people were maybe tuned, not out, but a little less in for the summer holidays and say this is what they're doing to try to quell this wave.
Okay, thank you so much to Josh Wingrove, our Bloomberg White House reporter. And we'll be watching Josh as we cover that report from President Biden later today. Coming up, Balance of Power is going to continue on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we'll have more from CoBank CEO Thomas Halverson. Plus, we're going to hear from ESPN Chairman Jimmy Pitaro. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.